Hello and a warm welcome to Tata Literature Live, the Mumbai International Lit Fest, co-sponsored by Tata Steel and Tata Projects and powered by Godrej. There will be a short Q&A at the end of the session, so please do send in your questions in the comment section of the platform you are viewing from. Writers often draw inspiration from what they know. But what happens when their identities are enmeshed in two different worlds? Today we have with us Karan Mahajan and Sanjena Sathian, both Indian American novelists who will lead a discussion on the frames of reference in a hybrid identity. Selected as one of Granta's best young American novelists in 2017, author and professor Karan Mahajan grew up in Delhi and then went on to study in the US. He is the author of Family Planning and Association of Small Bombs, the latter being named as one of the New York Times Book Review's 10 best books of 2016. Sanjena Sathian has worked as a journalist in San Francisco and Mumbai, and her award-winning short fiction appear in the literary journals Conjunctions, Boulevard, Joyland, Salt Hill, and The Master's Review. Her debut novel, Gold Diggers, has been longlisted this year for the Tata Literature Live First Book Award, Fiction, and is also an Amazon Best of 2021 pick. Sharing the discussion is Sonal Shah, a New Delhi-based writer and editor who writes on a diverse range of subjects for numerous publications. She has been a part of editorial teams at The Caravan, Time Out Delhi, and Vice India. And now, Wide Angle. A warm welcome to our panel.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm glad everyone could make it, and I think it's going to be an interesting discussion. We all have a lot of experience, living in two different societies, and I'd like to really delve into that maybe just right away. So, Sanjana, you grew up in Atlanta, but you've lived in Bombay for a couple of years, and as you were just telling me, you're also now kind of traveling to London quite often. You will possibly be traveling to Taiwan. And Karan, you grew up in Delhi, but you went to the US for college, and you've lived there for quite a few years now. So I wanted to talk about how your personal experiences and the back and forth that you've had have kind of shaped you as writers. It's a pretty broad question, but I want to get at that first. So maybe Sanjana, maybe we could start with you.
Yeah, I think that a lot of literary fiction is interested in like duality and bothness, and that's sort of the thing that I've taken from having a relationship to multiple cultures is just the feeling of being able to be both inside and outside a culture. I also, like, my book is sort of interested in that and also really satirizes the idea that that can be all-consuming, especially for Indian Americans, and that had sort of been taken to such an extent in the diaspora where people start to believe that the hyphenation is everything, when in fact we're all just freer beings than that. We can't get so hung up on like national identity that our art is only about like which state we have more affinity with.
And great question, Sonal. For me, I think the answer would be that identity takes a long time to change, and that one irrationally sticks to old identity. So I think for me, for example, I'm still processing the material from my childhood in Delhi, and that's after having been here in the US on and off for about almost 20 years now, which is shocking for me to think about, actually, because it was a kind of accidental immigration, staying on one more year, going back to Bangalore for a couple of years, going to Delhi, staying on. And so now I do sometimes look around me and wonder, why have I not fully engaged with the sort of dual identity I have, especially being in the US? And I'm trying more and more to do that. But, it's interesting. I think it takes me about 15 years to start processing experience. So that's one answer. And the other is that I think it's given me a sense, and this is similar to what Sanjana said, of being an outsider everywhere, which certainly comes through in my characters. And I certainly would not have been true in the same way if I had been a writer based in Delhi, perhaps, which is, where I grew up, the culture that I'm would have been a mainstream citizen of.
Do you feel like the impetus to write itself kind of grew out of this idea of being an outsider? I mean, specifically, I mean, for you, Karan, like when you went to college in the US, and for Sanjena, maybe after Karan talks on this, you could chip in, going to high school in the US, did you ever feel like, oh my God, I have to explain this thing about my culture, my background to these people, and I have to write it because they're just not getting it?
I think for me, it's the impulse has always been to combat a certain kind of existential loneliness I feel about the experiences I'm having, and to try to represent that if I don't find that in the fiction I'm reading. So my first book, Family Planning, is about a very sort of vulgar Punjabi Delhi, which is saturated with junk culture and with sexuality. And, those were all things that were around me in Delhi, but I didn't find in Indian fiction. So in some ways, it wasn't an impulse to explain, but I will say that when you leave your home, regardless, you could be going from Delhi to another city in India or to the US, you suddenly see it as material. I think when you're living there, it can be quite boring to try to process that material. You're like, you want to escape it.
And Sanjana,
yeah, I definitely also need distance from the material. I was trying to write about the Atlanta suburbs closer to when I lived there, just a few years after leaving, and the writing was really boring because I hadn't sort of developed like an angle on it, and I hadn't seen how funny it was. And then with a little bit of time, I could see how things like the anxiety of feeling like the only brown kid in school were both very real, but also worthy of humor and lightness, kind of combined with the honest daily tragedy of feeling like an outsider. I think it's that like comedy is tragedy plus time, and I always start with explaining to myself rather than trying to represent like a larger cultural experience. I was just trying to figure out like what my aesthetic relationship to my material was first.
That's great. Yeah. In fact, Sanjana, you wrote an essay kind of about we were just talking about lightness and comedy, and you wrote this really great essay talking about good immigrant novels, which was sort of about how the Jhumpa Lahiri, very realistic school of writing kind of set this precedent and pressure on you as an Indian American. So I wanted to ask if you could talk a little bit about that, and if this focus on what you called patient pretty prose and its psychologically realistic narratives or realist narratives is changing at all, and how you've been able to find that lightness. Karan, your first novel also like very humorous in many ways, and even your second though was dark, much darker. But maybe Sanjana, you could talk a little bit about that first.
Yeah, I think that I do think like this generation of writers, period, but also immigrant writers are finding much more playful ways to tell stories, and that doesn't preclude darkness, right? Like occasionally my book has been called a satire, and I don't think it's a satire. I think there's like a lot of realism in it. But for me, the sense of play came through kind of finding that comedy, which is really just a way of like locating a truer version of reality for me, but also by introducing speculative fiction into my work, because I was writing mostly realism for a long time, and I just took myself too seriously when I was writing realism. I thought like my books all had to have this like properness, and it read like I was trying to do something for school. And when I decided that I was going to add magic, and for a while I was playing with science fiction, which I'm not very good at, but I played with it. All of a sudden, like reality gets a little bit estranged, and then it just becomes like more malleable. And I think that's like a thing that in this age of everyone writing autofiction, we all have to figure out how to do, is like remember that we have narrative at our disposal, and I don't know, we have like what Rushdie talks about as like the wonder stories and like protean literature, like that is all still available to us. And I think we have to make sure we make use of it increasingly.
And I'll just add to Sanjana's a very eloquent answer that there's a certain school of immigrant literature in the US in which you can feel the author is striving to get an A+ from some kind of establishment which feels very much like an immigrant striving, like you need a perfect sort of Hemingway-esque prose. And one thing I loved about Sanjena's novel is that it's wilder and funnier, right? And I think she's right that is beginning to change. I think the difficulty that immigrant writers tend to have sometimes is that humor is so context specific. So then when you're split between places and identities, it can be harder to make that humor work. So I think that's the sense I get for why so much of immigrant writing can be humorless at times.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And actually, Sanjena, you mentioned Rushdie, and I was going to ask, I think there's a sense that there was a little bit of a kind of blowback maybe against writing in this wild and very desi humor way, actually. I mean, his magical realism, or whatever you want to call it, speculative fiction, it also used language in this very specifically desi humor way. And I think maybe there was a little bit of a backlash against that, or like maybe, oh, this has been done, we shouldn't do that, we need to fit into something else. Did either of you feel like nervous, or like how did you approach kind of writing in this? I mean, Karan, I think your book, The Association of Small Bombs, it's a very experimental book. You've used form in a really interesting way, where you start with this event and then you kind of like circle out both into the past and into the future. And geographically from that. And Sanjena, of course, you have this whole alchemical kind of theme going through, and all these wild things are happening, while at the same time it's extremely rooted in the everyday and the mundane. So yeah, so was it a challenge to kind of think about writing in a different way? And did you feel like, oh no, I'm writing in a way that's maybe not good as a South Asian to be doing, or something like that? Yeah.
I'm happy to go. Yeah, I think so. So Rushdie is an interesting person to bring up. I sometimes think of him as a comet from the future. Like the style that he invented doesn't actually have an audience in many ways, right? Because you have to, in some ways, actually, it only really works for an Indian audience, which is wonderful. But I think it's also that he was writing at a particular time where there was a very strong need to assert that a new kind of English was coming into being, right? He's writing in the 80s. Whereas I certainly felt very comfortable in my skin as a writer in English. So like the style, I'm sure, is influenced by people like Rushdie. It has Indianisms, but I've never felt the need to break apart language. What I have felt the need to do is to go local, right? I think the Rushdie canvas was always huge. Like for me, when I wrote my first book, and even Association of Small Bombs, it was always, how do I get to the neighborhood level of reference that I'm very familiar with? How do I make that the subject of literature? And it turns out, I wasn't alone in that, right? Like I think The God of Small Things, in some ways, though I didn't think of it in this sense, set that template for like the very hyper local Indian novel, and that has been the thing that people have been doing for a while. And it'd be interesting to see what a broad canvas novel would look like now, because things tend to come and go in waves with fiction.
Yeah,
that's so fascinating. And selfishly, as someone working on my second project and trying to figure out how to evolve, I'm like fascinated by the jumps that Karan took stylistically between those two books. I think for me, I was I didn't have a shortage of writers of South Asian origin to turn to for like what can English look like on the page. I did feel like I had a shortage in America, and Karan and I have talked about this, but like my book is sort of Jewish. Like it's like I took a lot from people like Roth, more than like South Asian literature. And I think that's partially just because it's nice to go outside of like your immediate sort of family and feel like you have the freedom to like cherry pick from other traditions. And in my case, I was just really interested in other literatures of assimilation, and feeling like I could see how a couple of other immigrant groups, like a generation in, how they evolved their own traditions was really useful for me. So I wasn't just thinking of myself as a Desi writer, but able to think of myself as an American writer.
And if I can just add something, actually, Sonal, to what Sanjena said, one thing she does in her book is that she's able to actually show a character struggling to enter into American history, which is tends to be a problem with Indian American novels, is that there's no direct charged relationship between Indian history and American history. So there can be a kind of floating weightlessness that occurs when you're writing a novel set here. And so people have to find a way around that. And in Sanjana's case, there's a character who's actively looking for an Indian character in the gold rush history, right? So it's all about sort of figuring out a form for these things.
Yeah, I mean, I noticed there was like a nice parallel between the two of, I mean, there's an association of small bombs and gold diggers, in the sense that small bombs is about an India that a lot of characters feel is becoming like too American. You know, it's set in the late 90s, early 2000s, and all these controversies about McDonald's coming in, and we're becoming too Western. Whereas Sanjana, your novel is really set in a time when America is becoming, or seems to be becoming, more Indian, or we're seeing America through an Indian America, you know? So I thought that was a really nice parallel. I wonder if either of you face sort of challenges kind of navigating these swiftly sort of changing cultural streams, and how you've dealt with them. You both said you both need a bit of distance from your context to write, but things do change really fast, you know? So
yeah,
maybe...
I think my characters grow up in a world where like they're not aware that the world of Karan's books exist. They're relating to an India that is like left behind in the 1960s or 1970s, not the extremely modern context that Karan's work comes out of. And I grew up and learned about that, but I think like I come out of this like, I don't know, diaspora frozenness. That once I got far enough away to see how wrong that was, once I moved to Bombay and got to live in like the actual India, then I could sort of break down what was false and what was fiction about my childhood. And I think that's something that's really important for all diaspora writers to try to do, is just to figure out like the lies we believed growing up about like what India was.
And in my case, you know, I think I immigrated, right, to the US. So for me too, I don't really feel that confident writing fiction set in India that goes beyond, let's say, 2010, which is 2010, 2011, which is when I was living in Bangalore for a couple of years. But really 2005 is, my limit. And so there's a sense in which I'm super familiar with everything from 1980 to 2005. But after that, my experience is similar to what Rushdie says about his character in Shame, which is that I experience India in stripes of time, right? So I'll be there for 3 months at a time. And so in the future, I'll have to find a way to dramatize that kind of fragmentation and to see what that actually means, like what it can mean beyond my experience, because that's also an experience that other immigrants share. Right. And that's changed from the time of Sanjana's parents, right, who were people who were probably going back once every few years. Right. So you have a very different, you think you actually have a pretty deep relationship with India if you're going back a couple of times a year, but obviously that is false in certain ways as well. So it's always about trying to figure out what lies, as Sanjana said, you're telling yourself, and what actually is your lived experience.
Yeah. And in India, context matters so much. I mean, everywhere it does, but what situation are you going back with your family? Are you going back by yourself? Are you going to work for someone? Like, all of these things make a huge difference in what you'll find to write about. We are actually at time for audience questions. So we have a couple, and if anyone else would like to send some in, I believe there are multiple ways in which you can do so. So I think we've a little bit talked about this, but Neil from YouTube wants to know, for both of you, do you look at both home and host countries differently when you are away from there? I'm not even sure which you would call home and host for either of you anymore, but maybe you could speak to that. Maybe starting with Karan?
Yeah, I mean, I do look at them differently, and I fear sometimes the reason I've not written about my host country, which is the US, which is a good way of putting it, I think, is that I will need to live in India actually to write well about America. Again, a question of distance, right? And a question of interest too, of being able to distill things and not feel like you're floating in this ocean of experience that is undifferentiated. I also think that there's a struggle that I'm facing psychologically that a lot of immigrants face, which is the question of coming up with a system of meaning in your host country that is on par with the system of meaning you had automatically in the place you grew up in, right? Because fiction is obviously one way of constructing that hybrid system of meaning, but I think there have to be other ways as well, which can then create this more charged relationship with the place you're in. Like, you don't want it to be that. I wouldn't want it to be that 20 years from now I'm still living in the U.S. pretending that I'm sort of not here, right? So that's like an ongoing struggle, and I think many immigrants have it.
Yeah. Yeah, context matters a lot. I mean, what you're doing when you're there. And Sanjena, would you like to reply briefly to that? Or?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think I'm more brash about what I feel like I have a right to write about when I'm thinking about the U.S. But when it comes to India, even though I've lived there, I'm always just overwhelmed by how much I don't know. But in both contexts, I often feel like I can only speak to a hyper narrow experience. Like, it's hard for me to write about even other corners of the Indian diaspora that I did not grow up in, let alone other corners of the South Asian diaspora. And when I wrote the sections of my book set in India, like, I interviewed my uncle for long periods of time. So I think it's probably good to have the humility of, like, being an outsider, which just makes you do interviews and do research and just not help yourself to stuff that you maybe don't.
Question related to that, so maybe you could just dive in, from Haritha on Facebook, who wants to know how much explicit research and interviewing did you have to do, Sanjena, to create Graduate Life in Berkeley, Life in the Silicon Valley, and Middle Class Maharashtrian Mumbai? So yeah.
There are a bunch of little worlds in my book. I probably did the most research for the history sections in 1849 California, because there's so little about Asian Americans in that period, let alone this one Indian character who appears. But the most fun thing I did was talk to my uncle for hours about, like, life and ragging at IIT Bombay, which was really fun.
And this Indian character turned out is a real historical fragment, right, that you found.
Yeah, figure in the gold rush probably existed. But.
Amazing, yeah. Karan, Veera on Facebook wants to know that you did an MFA and now you teach in such a program. Could you reflect on the classroom and teaching versus an apprenticeship model like the Guru Shishya Parampara?
It's a good comparison. In some ways, it's not that different. I tend to mostly teach literature in my MFA program. There's not as many classes where people are doing the classic workshop thing. So a lot of my classes are classes in which I am choosing a series of books that are helping me think through problems, and I'm having the students think alongside myself as well. So, like, I taught a class on modern Indian literature, or I taught a class on fiction versus nonfiction, like what the books that sort of merge the two categories, right? So to me, it's just a way of having sort of a more intense relationship with literature, and also, as a writer, keeping in touch with what young people are thinking, which is super interesting. The MFA, like everyone knows, has many pitfalls as well. There's a kind of committee atmosphere for literature, which lends itself to like a kind of curtailed style. But I think, again, we're in a certain era where, like, these critiques are available to us and everyone's self-conscious about them. So I hope that it has a salutary effect on people's writing and not sort of a curtailing effect.
Thanks. I have a question from Hirad on Instagram for both of you. Who are your favorite Indian writers? It's very straightforward. But putting you on the spot a little bit. Sanjena?
Well, everyone should read Karan's work because it was extremely important to me to encounter. I also have been really influenced by Arundhati Roy, Rushdie, and then for diaspora writers, Hanif Qureshi, and then a lot of cool people doing stuff in the U.S. now, like Amitabh Kumar and Hari Kunzru. Like we're really in kind of a plentiful age, which is really awesome.
Yeah, and I'll say Qureshi definitely seems like a sort of a person who's in conversation with Sanjena in a great way. I'm going to just name a few people who, at the top of my head, because I'm friends with so many Indian writers that I'm going to forget some of them. But one who I'm not friends with because he's dead is Yashpal, the famous Hindi writer who wrote 1,000-page partition novel Jhuta Sach, which is on par with War and Peace, I think. And contemporary writers, the ones that come to mind, Srinath Perur, I loved his travel book. If it's Monday, it must be Madurai. I think it's woefully underread. Atish Taseer's work, I really admire his prose writing. Then there's other people like Kiran Nagarkar, who I've always really liked. Arundhati Roy has been a huge influence. Someone I feel like I've read The God of Small Things dozens of times, and it keeps getting better. Anyway, yeah, those are some that come to mind immediately.
Great. We have a couple more questions, but not that much more time. So I have a question for Karan. From Shivani on YouTube, which is, how did you get the material to recreate the terrorist cells in Nepal, rural UP? Is it from reports in the media, non-fiction books? Maybe you could speak to that briefly, but more generally, I'd actually like to ask both of you about the relationship between the non-fiction work you've done and the fiction, if there is one. Karan, maybe you could start.
Yeah, it was very difficult to recreate that stuff because, a lot of it was non-fiction books, newspaper reports, court documents. I traveled to a lot of those places just to actually have a sense of atmosphere. But I do feel like one thing that you learn as a writer is that you keep getting better as a researcher. So like now I look back and I think, well, there's 10 different ways I would have done that now that I know how it's done, and I'm a little more confident about asking. But again, that I think some of that, the reason I wrote that is some of that is obscured by history. There isn't, for that particular terrorist attack, there wasn't any none of the members were around or people who were reachable. And so, yeah, some of it was just also imagination.
Yeah. Even though I was a reporter, I actually have done a lot more of my research so far just by reading and a handful of research by talking to people. But there were a lot of books about India and about the California gold rush that no one's tracking in the University of Iowa library. So that kept me pretty occupied.
That's amazing. There's another question for you, Sanjena, from Samira on YouTube, which is that in Lahiri's books, one encounters almost entirely only the Bengali diaspora, whereas your book has people from all over India. So what has changed about the Indian diaspora in the US, I assume? Yeah.
I mean, that's more about me. I'm like mongrel. My mom's side is Kannadiga. My dad's side is Malayali. My dad grew up in Chennai. My mom grew up all over the north. There are words in my house that I honestly don't even know what language they were in because there was so much peppered throughout. But I do think it's fun to not just be stuck in one corner.
Great. I think that is really great and has kind of contributed to the richness and the playfulness in your writing, I'm sure. I think we have to wrap up now, but thank you guys for a really interesting, if brief, session. I have so many more questions for you, and I think people on YouTube do too, but maybe we can go and answer those in the comments and hopefully, talk about this later some other time. So over to you, Jillian, to wrap things up.
That was a really illuminating conversation. Thank you, Karan, Sanjena, and Sonal for this really unique perspective. Thanks to our audience and to all our partners that have made this possible. The books discussed in the session are available at our knowledge partner, landmarkxcite.com. Tata Literature Live, co-sponsored by Tata Steel and Tata Projects, and powered by Godrej, continues with just a few more sessions today, so please do log in. Coming up right after this is what promises to be another riveting conversation. Climb Every Mountain with Indra Nui and Yogita Limai. See you there.